Good afternoon. My name is Frank Janussi, and I'm president of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this special event of the Mansfield Foundation, sponsored by the Embassy of Japan here in Washington, D.C., to discuss U.S. and Japan leadership of the free and open infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific. This dialogue came about as part of a discussion between the Mansfield Foundation and the Embassy of Japan about how we can do a better job reaching out to the public to inform them about how much the US and Japan are doing in the world on common interests. Mike Mansfield famously used to say that the US-Japan relationship was the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. And he said this as ambassador in the 1980s as he was working to resolve the trade frictions that existed between the United States and Japan at that time. But he said it with the wisdom that came of his deep knowledge of the Asia-Pacific region and his appreciation for the common interests of the US and Japan and the potential of the US and Japan to work together to address myriad security, economic, cultural, governance questions around the world. I think that since the 80s, we've seen a maturation of the US-Japan alliance across all sectors, in security, in economic development, in foreign assistance, in peacekeeping. And we've seen a growth in the coordination between Washington and Tokyo as they try to address emerging challenges, whether it's COVID or space, cybersecurity, and internet, free and open exchange of information, as well as defense of basic norms of good governance, democratic rule of law, and human rights. Prominent in today's discussion is the issue of infrastructure, because the world has such huge unmet infrastructure needs. And we know that those needs are going to need to be met. And the question is how and by whom and with what sustainability. So this afternoon, we've invited three wonderful speakers. I won't review all of their bios, but Watanabe-san, Courtney Weatherby, Suzuki-san are three people who can address these myriad questions for our audience. And we're going to try to take your questions as well. So if you have questions for our presenters, each are going to speak for 8 or 10 minutes here, and then we're going to have a roundtable discussion that we want to involve you in. Please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We've also opened the chat box. If you want to chat with each other or send messages to the panelists, you may do so, but please know that we may not get to any chat comments during our session. No guarantee of that. We'll do our best to take questions in the Q&A. This session is on the record. It's being recorded so that we might share the wisdom of our presenters with others who may be interested in this topic. And I can already tell our audience that we anticipate additional seminars on this subject area because it is extraordinarily rich. Enough from me. I think we're going to get right into our presentations. Watanabe-san is quite expert on looking at China, and in a lot of ways, the U.S.-Japan emphasis on the free and open Indo-Pacific region stemmed from an awareness of what China was doing with its Belt Road Initiative and its growing political and economic influence across Asia. And I would love for her to begin our discussion. Watanabe-san, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to share my screen. So. Can you see my screen? Okay, great. Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. My name is Shino Watanabe. I'm a professor at the Sophia University in Tokyo, Japan. But at this moment, I'm also a visiting scholar at SIGA Center for Asian Studies, George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And I'm very happy to be here today to talk about such a very important topic. In my observation, development finance is one of the most promising areas of US-Japan cooperation in the free and open Indo-Pacific. With that in mind, in my brief presentation, I would like to focus on two issues. First, development finance with Chinese characteristics. And then I would like to talk briefly about its challenges, opportunities as a starting point for our further discussion today. So let me start with development finance with Chinese characteristics. As you know, China is the largest creditor in the world today. And having said that, it's really hard to know exactly how much money China has extended as loans. A number of scholars investigated the total amount of Chinese overseas loans. And I don't want to go in detail today, but they basically agree they basically reach the same conclusion that China is the largest provider of development finance. At the same time, it's also well known that China's loans have very, very strict terms. For instance, according to research, Chinese development banks loans, their interest rates basically are between 3 to 6%. At the same time, Chinese export and import banks loans, their interest rates basically are from 2 to 3%. As you can see now, it's a really low interest rate area. In that sense, like Chinese loans do not necessarily offer attractive terms, especially to developing countries. But today, what I would like to emphasize is a third factor, that is diverse actors involving in China's development finance. We tend to think two policy banks, Chinese Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank, are primary actors of China's development finance. And of course, it's true. But at the same time, we should realize other important actors playing growing important roles today. And for instance, Ministry of Commerce in China offers non-interest loans without interest rates. At the same time, as you can see, Chinese state-owned commercial banks and also China's state-owned enterprises, Chinese SOEs, are also becoming integral part of China's development finance. So we should pay close attention to those like Chinese state-owned commercial banks and China's SOEs as well. And another important point I would like to highlight is that development finance by Chinese policy banks already reached peak around in 2016. For instance, if you look at the database created by Global Development Policy Center of Boston University, by the way, this is a fascinating database. And if you are interested in this topic, I strongly recommend you to take a look at it. It's on the web, and you can elaborate on a couple of new statistics based upon their data set. But in any case, according to their research, they found that two policy banks loans peaked already in 2016. At the same time, Chinese policy banks provide fewer loans directly to governments in developing countries. So those are kind of a new development we should keep in mind. In other words, Chinese policy banks offer loans directly to Chinese SOEs nowadays, or Chinese policy banks also offer loans to developing countries or governments or government agencies in developing countries, but through Chinese SOEs. So this development indicates Chinese lending, Chinese development finance is very, very opaque today, as you have imagined before. And then before I conclude my brief presentation, it's fair to talk about the bright side of Chinese development finance. So let me point out a few issues here. First, definitely Chinese development finance is a significant complement to the existing development finance by multilateral development banks like the World Bank, and also major donors like Japan. Because Chinese money can expand the scope and the sector and even geographic coverage of development finance. And Chinese policy banks tend to provide funding to less funded countries, which other major lenders have been reluctant to provide finance. And Chinese policy banks and China's development finance contribute to develop infrastructure projects, mainly in energy sector, as well as transportation sector in developing countries. These contributions we need to acknowledge. But it also means Chinese development finance and also Chinese banks face a very high risk that their loans will not be repaid in the future because of the countries they are borrowing. So Chinese development financing tend to fund energy and infrastructure projects instead of program loans. And if borrowers cannot repay loans, it creates a new set of problems, as in the case of Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. So this is another issue. Maybe we might be able to offer a different webinar. In any case, in conclusion, we cannot ignore a tremendous amount of Chinese development finance today. And it will continue to grow in the years to come, but not necessarily by Chinese traditional two policy banks. So we should start seriously thinking about how to deal with challenges posed by Chinese development finance in a broader sense. At the same time, we should also start seriously thinking about how to make good use of Chinese abundant resources, Chinese abundant capital for the benefit of all. So I will stop here at this moment. Thank you very much.
Arigato gozaimasu. Thank you so much, Watanabe-sensei. A couple of key takeaways for me from your presentation. The idea that the state banks, Ex-Im banks, peaked their lending perhaps already 5 or 6 years ago, and we need to pay more attention to other Chinese finance. Indeed, if the US and Japan governments are trying to work with China to have the right standards and norms on lending, and if we're only dealing with Ex-Im bank or state instruments, we're maybe missing the lion's share of what China is really doing in the finance realm, negotiating with the wrong people. Also, your emphasis on the fact that China, to some extent, is lending to those who otherwise might be neglected, high risk of non-performing loans, but they are serving a sector that the traditional lending instruments have often neglected or haven't been able to get to. And that offers actually some positive benefit for the world, but also has its own unique challenges associated with it. Now, JBIC, our next presenter from Suzuki-san from JBIC, JBIC and what used to be called the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC in the USA, are the obvious state alternatives to Chinese funding for infrastructure. And they have been coordinating closely and more closely together in the world in recent years. When I traveled not long ago to Vietnam, I was so impressed by how active JBIC was in the Vietnamese market. Suzuki Sensei, can you please share with us your thoughts about finance and the role of the US-Japan lending instruments in competition with China, please?
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. I'm delighted to be part of today's event together with other distinguished panelists. First of all, thank you for your kind introduction. My name is Hiroo Xuduki, Chief Representative of Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JBIC's Washington office. Today, I'd like to talk about JBIC's effort for further US-Japan cooperation, especially focusing on the infrastructure sector under the free and open Indo-Pacific. But before that, let me explain quickly about JBIC. And JBIC is policy-based financial institution, 100% owned by the Japanese government. Under the JBIC law, our legislation, our financing has 4 missions. First, contributing Japan's energy security. The second, supporting Japanese business activities overseas, such as exports, investment, etc. And third, tackling climate change. And finally, fourth, preventing disruption to international financial order. And I would like to also add that we have an operational principle to supplementing financial transaction implemented by private sector financial institutions. As a recent trend of the development finance is being more reliant on mobilizing private capital, JB's close collaboration with private players is one of our important characteristics compared with other development finance institutions. Then let me move to our effort for bilateral US-Japan cooperation together with trilateral cooperation, including Australia, and now developing the quadrilateral cooperation engaging India. Firstly, creation of the bilateral cooperation with our US counterpart. In November 2017, JBIC signed MOU for business cooperation with former OPIC, with aiming to develop and support projects mainly in the Pacific region. And in October 2018, the US government enacted the BUILD Act, strong support of the bipartisan support, both from Democrats and the Republicans, and integrated some of the USAID's responsibility into OPIC. As a result, the US International Development Finance Corporation is a long name, we call USDFC, was established in December 2019. After that, 2 institutions, USDFC and JBIC, cultivating the discussion for the cooperation in the infrastructure area, mainly focusing on the Indo-Pacific region. But we are now strengthening this bilateral cooperation. The last year, we signed the renewal MOU with USDFC, expanding the focus to cover such as sectors such as hydrogen, digital and information technology, and supply chain. And the regional perspective, we are expanding our effort to Western Hemisphere and the Central and the Eastern Europe, in addition to in the Pacific region. And JBIC and DFC, on a case-by-case basis, will invite third parties who share the same vision to our bilateral relationship. The one of the expanding cooperation is a trilateral cooperation together with Australia. In November 2019, JBIC signed a MOU with former OPIC and Australian counterpart, DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and EFA, Export Finance Australia, with aiming of promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific to drive potential projects in the Indo-Pacific region. I'd like to share with you a couple of the examples of our major commitment of these trilateral partners. First, in January 2021, last year, JBIC closed a loan for the submarine cable project in Palau, as the first project executed under this trilateral partnership. I'd like to add that JBIC provided export financing together with grant facility from USAID and also the grant facility from the Australian government. It's a very unique combining quasi commercial financing together with grant facility that we called this blended financing and mobilizing private capital. I think this is a very one of the example to foster the make a bankable project in the developing countries. So we would like to keep our effort to utilizing the blended financing scheme. So secondly, I would like to share with you that since 2019, trilateral partners already undertook the joint mission to identify prospective projects such as Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And we are discussing with Australia and the US for the another joint sending a joint mission this year also. Thirdly, I also would like to share with you that in 2019, the trilateral partner launched the concept of the Blue Dot Network for trusted standard for high quality infrastructure. And it certifies the suitability of individual project for investment. Although the details are still under the consideration, we have a continuous discussion with our counterparts in the United States and Australia. So finally, I would like to explain about the Quad Cooperation engaging India. JBIC and the Indian government confirmed future collaboration in third country. In November 2020, JBIC had a direct dialogue with Prime Minister Modi of India. And we discussed future collaboration, not only in India, but also in other South Asian countries. And we expect also our expectation for cooperation from India, which shared its vision for the free and open Indo-Pacific. And Prime Minister Modi mentioned that he had a very good detailed discussion with former Japanese Prime Minister Suga concerning the realization of the free and open Indo-Pacific. And he also said that he agreed with Indian and Japanese cooperation in other countries, such as development of connectivity for countries around India and also in Africa. And our effort already being materialized among the quadrilateral country. JBIC is part of a Quad Vaccine Cooperation right now. And at the timing of the last Quad Summit in September 2021, it is mentioned in the fact sheet of Quad Summit, mentioning that Japan through Japan Bank for International Cooperation will work with India to enhance key investment of approximately $100 million in the healthcare sector related to COVID-19, including vaccine and treatment drugs. So we would like to continue our efforts together with US bilaterally, together with other trilateral and quadrilateral cooperation, such as with Australia and India. So I will stop here and I look forward to having a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzuki-san. I'm very struck by your description of blended finance involving private sector, state sector, and grant support. I was not aware of that new financing mechanism, and I might like to delve into it a little bit further in our Q&A. And then I'm glad you brought up the Blue Dot Network. This was a Trump innovation which the Biden team seems to want to sustain. But as you point out, we're still lacking a lot of details about implementation about that. And we may want to get into that as well. You also brought home the reality that when we're speaking about finance, most of the projects that are on the table are in two sectors, energy and transportation. These are large, dominant sectors. And to help us explore one of those in greater detail, we're delighted to be joined by Courtney Weatherby, who's going to speak to the energy needs of the region and how the US and Japan working together are attempting to finance clean, sustainable energy projects and meet the demands of the region. Courtney, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Wonderful, and I'm going to go ahead and also share a brief PowerPoint here to walk people through some thoughts. So there are really two reasons that I think it's valuable to focus on energy in particular. And the first, as Frank said, is that it's a huge portion of the necessary infrastructure investment for developing Asia. And the second is that with climate change considerations becoming ever more politically important, both in the United States and Japan and in developing countries themselves, there's a real pull for infrastructure support in the energy space, specifically because of decarbonization efforts. So to start off here, I'm going to go ahead and just talk through a little bit about the needs in the region. So I think many on the call are probably familiar with the 2017 estimate from the Asian Development Bank that there's a major infrastructure gap, that developing Asia as a whole needs about $26 trillion of investment in infrastructure through 2030. Now that estimate covered a range of sectors. It included energy, it included transportation, water sanitation, telecoms, but by far the largest portion is for energy. About 51% of the total needed investment and infrastructure gap that needs to be filled is just in the energy sector alone. And I think it's worth looking at Southeast Asia as kind of a microcosm here, both because it's economically dynamic and important to the United States and Japan, and because there's been a lot of analysis on the specific opportunity for energy needs and transition in the region. So just looking at the energy sector, Southeast Asia needs $2.7 trillion of investment through 2040 to meet necessary energy projections. That actually rises to 2.9 trillion if you're considering climate resilience and climate risk when you're doing this infrastructure investment. And in part, that's because there's rapidly rising electricity and energy demand around the region. You're getting countries like Indonesia connecting people to a grid and providing electricity to communities that didn't have access before. You're seeing rapid industrialization and urbanization and rising living standards, and there's just a rapid growth. So there's an increase of 60%, or actually about the size of Japan's total electricity network, that needs to be added to Southeast Asia through 2040. Now, with those needs in mind, public spending is actually quite limited. I did some analysis, and these numbers are pre-COVID, so this has probably changed somewhat, but I did some analysis in 2019 and 2020, looking at sort of the annual needs for expenditure in Southeast Asia. And if you put the public spending every year is only about $50 billion. If you look at sort of the annual average spending on energy infrastructure from some of the key donor banks and development partners, JICA, ADB, AIB, et cetera, that still only provides about $22 billion, even if most of that is channeled towards Southeast Asia. And that leaves a $54 billion gap every year that needs to be met within the energy sector. So there's a real need, as has already been talked about today, to sort of catalyze and bring in further private sector investment in this space. And that requires not only working with private sector investors, but also working with governments in the region to figure out why their projects are currently not bankable or not attractive to international investors. This has been complicated. The whole picture has been complicated because of the COVID situation. So COVID-19 disrupted supply chains. We had all of these regional shutdowns that impacted the timeline for a number of projects. It impacted the short-term energy demand. We saw a regional contraction. Manufacturing is kind of a key driver of energy demand in the region. So you've seen sort of ups and downs due to the economic recovery. Now, that's not going to change the long-term trajectory, but it has sort of altered the financing landscape, where you saw a lot of sort of shifting of priorities from governments, which had previously been gearing up to focus on infrastructure, physical infrastructure for energy and transportation, shifting their focus understandably to emergency response and health infrastructure, which is still increasingly a focus because the pandemic's revealed weaknesses in that space, and that was not accounted for in a lot of these previous infrastructure investments. And finally, the energy sector gains a lot of attention specifically because of that growing pressure to decarbonize. So I think many of us were sort of watching what was coming out of COP26 this year, that the impacts of climate change in Southeast Asia are already very visible, where you're seeing sort of changes in the intensity of major weather events. You're seeing changes in the intensity of droughts and floods, which are still a somewhat normal process because of the El Nino and La Nina process, but that's getting worse. So there is sort of a rising consciousness, I think, in many countries around Southeast Asia that they need to decarbonize. We saw commitments to carbon neutrality coming out of Thailand and Vietnam, both of which have relatively fossil fuel heavy energy industries. And this, those are two specific examples, but these pressures are felt throughout the region. So you're facing that dual challenge of expanding electricity generation and energy access while also needing to transition. So this really provides a real clear opportunity for the United States and Japan and other development partners to fill some of those needs, because, although China is heavily invested in Southeast Asia, a lot of its investment is in the fossil fuel generation sector or in large scale hydropower, which has its own environmental challenges. Most of China's investment in alternative renewable energy like solar and wind is actually through the supply chain. Chinese SOEs have not yet come into Southeast Asia to invest in these renewable energy projects in mass. So there's a real opportunity before that happens for the United States and other donors to play a potentially constructive role here. So I do think it's useful briefly, and I am going to be brief here, to talk about what the United States and Japan are already doing in this sector in terms of cooperation. I think that Suzuki-san already gave a good overview of sort of the quality infrastructure framework, but it is worth recognizing that the last 5 years in particular, we've seen kind of a growth of Japan-US framework agreements for collaboration on energy infrastructure. So in 2017, there was the Japan-US Energy Partnership, which included collaboration across a wide range of things, included advanced nuclear technology, it included development of a global natural gas market, as well as developing sustainable, affordable, reliable, secure energy infrastructure around the developing world. We've also seen some very regional specific programs like the Japan-US Mekong Power Partnership, which focuses very specifically on collaboration in mainland Southeast Asian countries defined by the Mekong River geographically to support sustainable, reliable, and affordable energy and electricity access. There's a whole slew of different initiatives that the US and Japan have independently and in a coordinated manner done in this space, particularly with technical assistance and capacity building, but there is some focus among those projects on supporting an integrated power grid, so looking at regional electricity trade and how that can improve energy access and affordability, reliability. And finally, just this past year, we saw sort of a targeted focus on Japan-US Clean Energy Partnership. So again, really sort of honing in on this climate and decarbonization consideration. So with that in mind, I do think there's a few specific opportunities that the United States and Japan have to really push forward both their concrete and their technical assistance within the energy space in Southeast Asia specifically, but I think many of these lessons would be useful and approaches would be useful for other parts of developing Asia as well. And the first, and Frank sort of touched on this before briefly, is really to sort of operationalize the Blue Dot Network sooner rather than later. There's been, when it was first announced, there was a lot of enthusiasm for the concept, particularly because it was announced at a time when there was a lot of visible concern about some of the impacts of Chinese infrastructure investments in Southeast Asia. So I heard a lot of enthusiasm during my trips to the region, my conversations with folks from both government sector, academic, private sector, NGOs about, this is a potentially really useful opportunity. But despite the progress behind the scenes with the steering committee and an executive consultation group, I think there's been sort of this sense that it's not moving, which is probably not an accurate sense, but it's not moving publicly. So I think that there's sort of this timely window of opportunity as we start to see a the post-COVID economy returning in Southeast Asia, hopefully later this year. There is an opportunity as this infrastructure investment starts to move forward again as a key priority focus to try and show a real clear criteria for what projects can get into the Blue Dot Network and really highlight some flagship projects that show off what do these high quality and best practice standards mean. And that can really inform a lot of that post-COVID recovery planning that we're seeing in individual countries as they start to come out with their own infrastructure investment strategies for the future. This obviously sort of overlaps, and a lot of these post-COVID recovery plans are sort of overlapping with that climate consideration and renewable energy expansion. So I do think with that space as well, there's further opportunity to provide joint support for technical assistance and pilot projects. The United States and Japan are both heavily active in this space in the region. Japan obviously is supporting, has supported a lot of technical assistance over the years for power planning agencies, and the Mekong in particular, on national power planning processes, on transmission assessments. I know some Japanese companies have expressed interest in potentially investing in the power grid in Southeast Asia to help, again, improve energy security for the region. There's interest in hydrogen pilot projects. I think there's opportunities to try and do more coordination between the United States and Japan in this space, along with other Quad actors. Like Australia is heavily involved in energy, and I think India has a lot of lessons it can share from its own experience with deployment of solar that are very relevant for Southeast Asia and other developing countries in Asia. So I think there's space to do a little bit more close coordination on these. That could be done through joint technical assistance projects, but it could also be done through complementary direct investment in in pilot projects in the region. I think there's a slew of sort of challenges and obstacles that still need to be worked through to really proceed with projects that are from beginning to end, from soup to nuts, joint venture projects. Those consortiums really haven't been sort of ready to go between the US and Japan on the ground in Southeast Asia, although I think we are starting to see the fruit of a few years of networking that JBIC and DFC and others have been doing with projects like the electrification grid in PNG, as well as potential projects in Indonesia and Vietnam. But there's probably more that can be done, for instance, in identification of clean energy zones, where you've got one country investing in renewable energy power generation projects, another company investing in improving the grid in that area or improving battery storage projects in that area. And I think there's a particular angle here that the US and Japan can support, which is looking at the role of multinational corporations as drivers of this, because there are a lot of places that are sort of heavy manufacturing with an international presence. Many of these companies have their own targets for renewable energy. And so there's kind of a demand coming with links to the United States and Japan, because many of these companies are headquartered there or aiming to expand their renewable energy and sustainability commitments in line with sort of the national goals of their home country or their headquarters. So I think there's real opportunity to do more coordination in that space. And I'm going to go ahead and stop there because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for an active discussion.
Thank you so much, Courtney. I'm struck by, in your presentation, about the requirement for norms to be in place to drive some of these investments in clean energy. And I would like to begin with a quick question to all three of you, which is when we think about US, Japan versus China in the realm of finance, the comparison that often comes to mind is that the US and Japan are attempting to lend and develop projects in accordance with norms of sustainability, clean energy, transparency, as opposed to opacity, that are very different from the norms that accompany Chinese lending. But my threshold question to all of you is this an asset for us or a liability? In the competition for projects, in the effort to ensure that those norms are propagated so that we have sustainable economic development, that we have anti-corruption standards. I always imagine that imposes some cost on the US and Japan as we're trying to engage in these projects, that we might lose out in the bidding for them. But is it also an asset? And on balance, is it more of an asset or more of a liability? If you could take a quick cut at that. Suzuki-san, can I ask you to start maybe, and then Watanabe-san?
So we must keep our effort to make this our important asset. And as mentioned in the previous presentation, the Blue Dot Network is starting from the G20 Core Infrastructure Investment Principle, and we would like to operationalize this project, this principle into each project. And I also would like to mention that China also included among the signer of the G20 Core Infrastructure Investment. So we need to be more inclusive, more open, and more transparent. That is a characteristics of our concept of financing.
Thank you, Suzuki-san.
I believe that's a regional country expects strongly.
Thank you, Suzuki-san. And Watanabe-san, it sounds to me like Suzuki-san is recommending that we also not write off China. In other words, that China itself is not necessarily committed to operating in ways that are not transparent, and that China itself may want to invest in infrastructure that is sustainable. Are there ways to bring China along to continue to improve their performance? You know, back in the first 3 decades of US-China relations, the assumption always was that China would gradually be more and more in alignment with international norms. And I think in recent years, just in the last 4 or 5 years, our confidence in that proposition has been severely eroded. But are there ways in which we can continue to try to move China along the path of greater transparency, greater attention to sustainability and non-corruption in infrastructure lending and finance?
For a very fascinating question. And my short answer is yes, definitely yes. As Mr. Suzuki briefly mentioned, China is making effort to accommodate with the international standard. And I think development finance is a promising area in this regard because it is somewhat based upon market principle, a little bit different from like security issues. In that sense, in any way, the market principle is a very powerful, in a sense that all countries need to somewhat converge into specific practices. And then actually, even back in 2017, Chinese Ministry of Finance already issued a kind of a guideline to make Chinese loans more feasible and also like make it more like sustainable. And if you look at the document, you can see that at least like a high level and also top level, they share some kind of concerns of importance of sustainable finance. But the thing is, China is such a big country. And as I mentioned, even those like a provider of development finance are diverse. And if you think about the BR project, how many companies, how many stakeholders in just working in one single project, it's almost countless. In this sense, I have seen a kind of gap between the perception of top policy makers or people working inside the Chinese central government and people or like experts or even factory workers working on the ground level in developing countries. So like even though the Chinese government tries to accommodate with certain standard, it takes time and it continues to create difficult problems in the future.
I think that's a very keen observation. I visited a hydropower project in Laos several years ago that was being constructed by China. I had discussed the project with Chinese leadership in Beijing, and they had assured me of various standards and norms and so on. And of course, when I got there on the ground in Laos, what I saw was very different. And I don't think that Chinese officials in Beijing were necessarily, lying to me. I think there was just a gap between their policy aspirations in terms of involving local labor, for instance, in the project, and the realities of the Chinese construction engineers managing the project, who had brought in all of their workforce essentially from Yunnan province, to manage the operation. And there was a real gap. We have a couple of wonderful questions that are linked in the Q&A box. A board member of the Mansfield Foundation, Russ Deming, asks, how do Chinese banks handle defaults? Do they demand an equity stake in the defaulting institution as a way of trying to address default? And Larry Greenwood asks a kind of a tangential question to that. It's a very good question. He points out that institutional investors, as something that all three of you have mentioned, that private sector institutional investors are a large potential source of financing for infrastructure, complementing whatever JBIC or USDFC might be doing in the world. And that the Blue Dot Network is an important way to try to lower the risk for such institutional investors. But nonetheless, there seems to be some hesitancy, as has been pointed out, in attracting private sector investment to close that gap that Courtney spoke of 50 billion a year, even just in the energy sector, the gap between the demand and the needs and the available finance. And might the US and Japan consider guarantees of some sort to jumpstart or leverage institutional investors? If I could ask maybe Watanabe-san, if you could answer the first question about how the Chinese handle default, and then get Courtney and Suzuki-san to talk a little bit about the second question, ways to catalyze more institutional investors in partnership, and maybe that blended finance idea that Suzuki-san pointed out is a harbinger of things to come. Watanabe-san, first to you, please.
Thank you very much. Again, this is a very important question. And actually, it's a really hard question for Chinese to answer as well, I think, not by myself. And there are several ways. The standard ways is to take collateral when they then extend loans. At the same time, I sometimes read a couple of papers talking about China asking developing countries, or not necessarily the governments, but sometimes the firms, to force them to make escrow accounts within the Chinese banks. So that usually Chinese development finance, most of the time, as I said, are infrastructure project. And it's almost somewhat similar to a project finance model. In other words, some kind of revenues are produced through Chinese infrastructure, Chinese built infrastructure project. In that sense, those revenues are stored in Chinese banks. At least then it somewhat decrease the kind of total failure. In other words, at least some part of the money could be serviced. But at the same time, I think I don't think that's enough, given that where China has extended loans, as Mr. Januzzi mentioned, very difficult countries who are less funded before. So in that sense, China, I think, is trying to create very creative measures to avoid the risk of default. And we have to see, we have to continue to pay close attention to that.
Thank you, Watanabe-san. Courtney, what about this issue of trying to sort of catalyze the Blue Dot Network in support of infrastructure investment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to just sort of touch on at least some of the obstacles that have prevented institutional investors from coming into these emerging markets. And I can speak most clearly with case studies from the energy sector. But one of the major challenges that we see with energy infrastructure, particularly renewable energy infrastructure, is sort of a lack of policy clarity and regulatory clarity that makes attractive projects in these countries. So for instance, in Vietnam, we've seen a wealth of investment in the solar market in recent years, where they added 9 gigawatts of solar in 1 year, which is massive. It brought it up to almost 20% of their national energy plan. But most of this investment was actually from Vietnamese investors and then other investors in Asia. There was a relatively limited participation in this from most of the major global firms that you might expect from the United States, from Japan, and other Western countries. And the major reason for that was concerns about the risk. The power purchase agreement terms were not up to international standards, and they placed a large amount of the risk for these projects on the developers themselves. Now, Vietnamese developers who had the finance, who knew the market, who were able to sort of lock in these rates, felt that was a risk worth taking. But many international investors simply will not touch projects like that until those power purchase agreements and other regulations surrounding project development are brought up to international standards. So I do think that there are real opportunities, and obviously this will vary significantly country to country, but there are real opportunities to work on sort of that technical capacity building space in the legal overview space, providing legal assistance in informing these regulations and updating these policies to make sure that they're going to be attractive to international investors. And that is something that I know the United States has been doing, and individual countries, or I think Japan has also been doing this, but there's probably more coordination that can be done in that space, and really more framing of, sort of this, in order to meet your future carbon goals, you have to be able to attract international assistance, to get that next 9 gigawatts of solar power in Vietnam. They probably don't have the resources domestically. They're going to need to update those policies and draw in international investment. So there's a clear payoff here, even though there's a little bit of a painful process right now to make those updates. And as those updates are made and the policy situation improves, I do think that will help de-risk some of these projects and bring in some of those international investors. On the other hand, there is also the other suggestion, which I've seen made before, and I think there are some limitations that were previously in OPIC, which have been relieved somewhat for the DFC in terms of providing guarantees. There might still need to be more overhauls on sort of the policies in place, but the other option here is for the United States DFC or other international multinational development banks or multilateral financiers to provide guarantees. And one aspect that may still be useful there is that many of these local off-takers, for instance, the national utilities in many of these countries, they may not have a very good credit rating. So that's another risk element that's to some degree outside the control of the investor. And if they can't get a guarantee for that, if Electricity Du Lao or Electricity Vietnam were to default on that loan, then that pain falls on the investor. So finding a way to guarantee these projects, to guarantee these purchase agreements. I know it's been explored. I think that JBIC may have done some work in this space, and Suzuki-san may be able to share some thoughts on that. But that's one other sort of option for de-risking investments in a way that could help bring in these institutional investors that are currently very leery.
Thank you, Courtney. I'm glad you mentioned the legal framework, and this is an area where the U.S. worked with Vietnam in the past under something called the STARS program, where we were trying in the early days of Vietnam's integration with the global trading system to modernize their trade and investment laws. And we worked directly with the Vietnamese National Assembly even to sort of help draft those laws and provided technical assistance to reduce risk and create an environment in Vietnam that was more conducive to foreign investment. Sounds to me like you're suggesting that not just loan guarantees, but other ways, purchasing power agreements on power, for instance. I mean, other ways to modernize and update Vietnam's legal infrastructure, could help to reduce the risks. Suzuki-san, briefly on this topic of how to leverage institutional investors in support of what JBIC and USDFC are doing.
I totally agree with you that the importance of engaging the institutional investor. And for example, I'd like to share with you that under the preparation of the Blue Dot Network, we closely communicated with OECD, and the OECD is inviting some broader roundtable from the institutional investors. And from Japan, they closely communicated with Keidanren, and we are very welcome any inputs from the institutional investor for the current discussion of the Blue Dot Network. And secondly, I also would like to share with you our effort to mobilize money from the institutional investor in addition to the blended finance. JBIC have a continuous effort to securitize our loan, especially after the completion. Because from the private financing viewpoint, taking a completion risk is one of the tackle. So we regularly try to securitize our loan to transfer our loan to the local banks and the institutional investor in Japan. That is one of the example of our current effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzuki-san. A member of the US-Japan Network for the Future and expert Congressional Research Service scholar on US-Asia relations, Mark Banyan, asks in the Q&A box, how well are the US and Japanese development financing systems harmonized to facilitate cooperation? This was a question I also thought of when Suzuki-san was talking about the four-part JBIC agenda: energy security, supporting Japanese businesses, addressing climate change and sustainability, and preventing disruption of the financial order. I think that this rather closely aligns with the US DFC priorities, of course, with the US supporting US business as opposed to Japanese business. But could you speak, Suzuki-san, to how closely harmonized are these mission statements? And then Mark has a twist on the question, which is, are those mission statements aligned also with JICA and USAID? Because the blended finance and the grants and the aid agenda needs to somehow, I think, complement the finance agenda. And how are we doing in coordination on that?
Thank you. And traditionally, we try to seek some specific project participation both from Japanese companies and US company, but it is very hard to find such kind of the project. So recently, we carefully coordinated with our USDFC. We firstly make a target country and the target sector. Under this concept, we parallelly seek a specific project. For example, in case of the pharmaceutical sector in India, USDFC will provide their financing to the specific Indian private pharmaceutical company. But on the other hand, JBIC will provide the financing towards the state-owned banks of India. So that is a little bit different from the previous effort. So I think that this effort would be more effective to enhance the collaboration between the two institutions. And I also would like to mention that cooperation with other agencies is a very important aspect. So we are enhancing the interagency cooperation both in United States and Japan. And we sometimes utilize cooperate with USAID or USTDA, but the opposite would be useful. So the comments from the audience is very useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzuki-san. I will give the Mansfield Foundation a pat on the back. Our Mansfield Fellowship Program is in its 25th year, sending US federal workers to work inside the Japanese government across 50 different agencies. And I think that the coordination mechanisms between the US and Japan have been enhanced by the efforts of 200 alumni of that fellowship program, many of whom have come from parts of the US government that are involved in international aid coordination and finance and treasury and commerce and state. So I hope that we can ever strengthen those coordination mechanisms because they are so important. And at the end of the day, it takes people to make that policy coordination happen. We are almost out of time, and the words AIIB, I think, have not really been spoken, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and we've only scratched the surface of the issue of the Quad. In the last 2 minutes here that we've got, will people please rapidly share, should the US and Japan reconsider their posture on the AIIB as European nations and the Republic of Korea have done? Is it necessary for us to join the AIIB to have a greater influence over it, or can we safely sort of let it go on its way and continue to do our own thing? And with respect to the Quad, is the Quad a real thing? What is your optimism or pessimism about the future development of the Quad? Because it strikes me that whatever the US and Japan are doing together could be and likely will be enhanced to the extent that we're able to draw in other partners on quality infrastructure investment and quality sustainable green energy investments, and that this is an area where the Quad perhaps can play a meaningful role. So AIIB, thumbs up, thumbs down, and Quad, a bright future, or is it going to die on the vine? And let me start with you, Suzuki-san, and then I'll go to Courtney, and Watanabe-san, you'll have the last word.
So JBIC has a close communication with ADB, and Japan is one of the major shareholders. And we would like to firstly utilize ADB to support the regional demand of the infrastructure. But I'm not sure in the future there's a possibility to collaborate with AIIB, but firstly, we are keen to collaborate with ADB. And regarding the Quad, currently it is our understanding Quad is not a security alliance. So therefore, the non-security cooperation is very important at this moment. And I believe the infrastructure is one of the key areas for the cooperation among the Quad countries. Thank you.
Great, and thank you for your succinctness. Courtney, to you, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of the AIIB, I'll just sort of circle back to the need. There is an infrastructure gap, and there has to be a space for China, and there has to be a space for the AIIB to come in here, because the need is so great that excluding them would only harm the interests of the countries in the region. So I do think that there's opportunities to coordinate with the AIIB more closely. I think there needs to be more conversation and discussion with the AIIB about some of these, high quality infrastructure investment principles and how they're implemented, and try to coordinate across many of the multinational development banks that are interacting in this space, because what we don't want are different frameworks for exactly what quality infrastructure means and how exactly to interpret what those G20 principles for quality infrastructure mean on the ground. So, I think in that sense, there needs to be engagement with the AIIB. In terms of the Quad, I'll just note, I think it's been kept relatively informal for a reason. It's been a concept that I remember reading about in grad school a decade ago before it became its current version. So I would actually say it's probably not going to wither on the vine. I think it's a perennial thing that will pop up in times like right now, where there are clear, parallel and complementary interests between the four in the infrastructure space on vaccine diplomacy, where there are clear, concrete opportunities to do something collaborative. I think we'll continue to see that sort of engagement, and that's a positive thing. But I do think it's difficult to operationalize, as we've seen, even with just, physical on the ground joint venture projects between the United States and Japan. That takes time. That takes a lot of networking. It takes a lot of working through those bureaucratic hurdles to move forward. And we're starting to see those fruits now after a few years in PNG, in Indonesia and Vietnam. I think with the Quad, it's just going to be more complicated, but it certainly doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing. But it's going to be, that fruit needs to first blossom and then bear fruit. So we're at the point where we're just starting to see those vines develop, and it'll take time to see some of those physical benefits on the ground.
Thank you, Courtney. I look forward to drinking that fine wine when it's ready. Watanabe-san, final word to you, please.
Thank you very much. As for AIB, I personally think it's not necessary for the US and Japan to join AIB at this moment. And I think maybe the strategy of the US and Japan, in hindsight, worked well, meaning that because now AIB include other important EU members and other both the developed countries beyond the EU, Europe. And then it has some kind of a mechanism to monitor China's management from inside. At the same time, thanks to the US and Japan not joining, of course we can argue in this point, but I have to simplify my answer at this moment. So let me, I'm sorry to say this, but thanks to the US and Japan's kind of a decision not to join, we also have a kind of a nice mechanism to monitor AIB from outside. So it's kind of a nice balance, both like outside and inside, to see where the AIB is going. And I think my assessment of AIB has been pretty good. I think AIB has been an important stakeholder of like development finance. So in this sense, we don't have to break this balance anymore at this moment. And then another question on Quad. I think Quad is definitely not the alliance. Even though the naming Quad is kind of tricky, identifying like 4 members, but it's not the alliance. It means that it has a plenty of room for the Quad member to include other important partners. In that sense, this is a nice framework, in addition to the US-Japan Security Alliance. And of course, it's not a purely security issue. And as Suzuki-san mentioned, Quad is also have an excellent opportunity to work together in non-security issues. So I think Quad is a promising mechanism. At the same time, my final word is that Quad is also successfully institutionalized US commitment in the Indo-Pacific, which the previous Trump administration has not been successful. Now that we have a Quad and with US as the most important partner among the Quad, then US cannot go outside the Indo-Pacific, even after the Biden administration. Thank you.
On that happy note of US institutional commitment to the Indo-Pacific, a free and open Indo-Pacific, and one that we hope will be prosperous and secure and green and sustainable, I want to express my deep appreciation to Shino Watanabe, a professor of Faculty of Global Studies at Sophia University and a Fulbright visiting scholar at George Washington University, to Hiroyuki Suzuki, Washington representative of JBIC here in Washington, D.C., and Courtney Weatherby, the deputy director at the Stimson Center's Southeast Asia program, and a research analyst with Energy, Water, and Sustainability program at Stimson, for a very stimulating conversation. I want to thank Julianne Doscher, program manager at the Mansfield Foundation, for recruiting 3 such fabulous speakers and setting up this program. And we have only just scratched the surface of the infrastructure issues. So I suspect that we will be revisiting these topics in the weeks and months to come. I want to thank our audience for joining us for this special Mansfield Foundation event, sponsored by the Government of Japan Embassy here in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for your excellent presentations and for our audience for your good questions. And we are adjourned. Thank you so much. Arigatou gozaimasu. Bye-bye. Thank you.